For those of you who don't know me, I'm Roy. I'm a senior software engineer at the Walt Disney Company. I do a lot of Angular stuff on the side, and I'm mainly a WordPress developer, so that's where my CMS kind of background is. Matt, why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name's Matt Davis. I'm a lead architect for a company called MediaCurrent, and I've been building sort of decoupled CMS architectures for actually quite a long time now, depending on what you count as decoupled CMS. But really cut my teeth on the enterprise version of that with weather.com build starting about 3 years ago, and then really got into Angular, helping build out the sister site for their underground. And was part of the keynote at NGConf 2 years ago. So this is a problem space that I've been involved in quite a while, and mainly from the Drupal decoupled side.
Nice. Ben, why don't you go up next?
Sure thing. My name's Vimo, short for Ben Moore, and I'm a business intelligence developer for the customer experience operation team at WP Engine. WordPress is my go-to along with Angular, and I've been working out a framework to make it easier to build out a full actual web application, not just rebuilding a website.
Cool. Zach?
My name's Zach Chappell. I'm a software architect over at Career Builder, organizer for NGATL. Been working on a lot of custom homegrown meta-driven CMSs at both ADP and Career Builder, and trying to hope that we can get to something standardized a little bit.
Cool. And our most famous guest on this show, as always, Brian.
My name is Brian Martin. I'm a lead developer for MBA.com. You may recognize me. I'm the MBA dude from the keynotes. I'm kind of a big deal. I just got home, so I'm going to eat this entire bag of popcorn while we talk.
Awesome. So kind of pre-show, we were talking about what these conversations would lead to. So I want to just kind of continue that conversation. So I think, we're all kind of coming, based on last conversation, I don't feel like any of us are going to change what CMS we're using. Zach, you kind of brought up the kind of enterprise realm where it's like that's probably the only time it's something that's really custom, where you're not going to choose an out-of-the-box CMS. You're not going to choose WordPress or Drupal or really anything. You're going to find something really custom because you're going to have really specific needs for that enterprise. So I think, I don't know, is there a way
I don't even know if I agree with that, honestly. I mean, part of the reason we choose Angular is because it puts guardrails in place for us, right? So that's part of what makes it suitable for enterprise. So that's part of why big companies would choose a WordPress or a Drupal too, is what kind of guardrails do you want in place versus how much of that stuff do you want to have to create from scratch, right? There's cost benefit to either way.
Totally agree, but I also think that with CMS like WordPress or Drupal, you're really locking down the data model. Unless you really want to customize data model, which I know Drupal has a little bit more flexibility than WordPress does. Like WordPress, assumingly, unless you're doing custom data structure, you're basically dealing with the same kind of post object and all the custom types of that. So that's the only kind of real, I think, pain point with using an out-of-the-box CMS. Plus, you're using their Drupal or WordPress's communication to the database, right? Like you're kind of locking yourself into how they interact with the database, whether it's pulling data, getting data, also locking yourself into what kind of database. You're in Drupal and WordPress, it's MySQL, but if you want with a custom CMS, theoretically you could use any type of backend or any type of database. Sorry.
Well, I mean, with the power of the REST API now, though, you could still use whatever you want and build your own connectors and still use all of the pluses from WordPress and pull all of your data from anything.
Exactly. That's one of the main values of being fully decoupled, right? Is that your rendering layer doesn't have to care where the data is coming from or how it was generated.
Yeah, no, totally agree with that. So I'm curious if again, we could sit here and argue about my CMS is better than your CMS all day.
Drupal's
So-
better.
Yeah. So I'm curious if maybe there's some way to standardize post CMS. Like, all right, you've agreed to the CMS. What is the next step between that and rendering?
Well, and that's the part that I think is kind of interesting because a lot of the stuff I've seen, the CMS is generating, in some cases, generating the markup itself. Sometimes the CMS is just pumping out the data. And some of the homegrown ones that I've worked on, we actually output a JSON object that was basically controlling the rendering and layout of the page, as well as all the APIs that page was bound to, along with autocompletes and all that stuff. So it can go as really complex or really simple on the CMS side, and the exact same on the front end. So, that's where the challenge is going to be. Do we want the CMS to take over some of the layout stuff, or do we want the front end to take that over? And to what extent? Do we want to have a custom wrapper for Angular to take a JSON object and turn that into a view, or do we want to build that on the CMS side?
Rendering out is always kind of like Matt and I talked to Matt about this a lot at NGConf just because it fascinates me trying to kind of bridge the gap between client-side rendering but still having the performance of server-side. So assumingly if you have a CMS that is server-side, at least like Node or PHP or whatever, you could do some of the rendering to increase performance on the server versus dumping just JSON data and assuming that the client's going to handle all of the rendering, right? Because that might be detrimental if you have a lot of rendering to do.
I mean, I think if we're agreeing that every CMS has its strong points and getting the data out there, but they all drastically differ when it comes to the actual render and how it controls the front, then I would totally agree that Angular, the front, should take care of everything, right? As much as absolutely possible, so that it doesn't matter where any piece of the data is coming from.
Yeah. To me, it really comes down to how much you need to be configurable by an editor of the site, right? So on the project that I'm working on, we actually are decoupling layouts. And we do have a JSONified representation of what a layout is because we want editors to have control over what they put into those layouts.
Do you also, with that JSON object, are you also doing like ACLs around different aspects of that object as well?
Yep.
Interesting.
So, I'm curious how like all of that could play into. So Angular Universal is now a thing. Man, I know that you are probably, well, as far as I know, you're the most experienced one here with it. So I'm curious how that would relate to CMS on the render side. And are you guys using it in your use case?
Well, actually, on the project I was just describing that has decoupled layouts is not using an Angular piece at all. But it would be interesting to attempt such a thing with decoupled layouts. That'd be a little tricky, but you could do it with some dynamic component magic.
Yeah, so we were actually doing that at Career Builder for a period of time, and then we completely changed the scope of our project and stopped doing it, which never happens at an enterprise. But we had it so that we could take in that JSON object, scaffold the entire screen, and it took 100 milliseconds or so to scaffold that page. But it was off that JSON object, and we did it before we started using Universal. So we did that 100% on the client. But granted, that was a enterprise app that had a login, so we didn't have to worry about SEO or anything like that. So that makes it a little bit easier to not require Universal. But at the same time, a lot of the sites that I'm hoping to use this CMS solution with are sites that also have to be compatible with SEO. So I know Brian would probably need something like that, especially with what he does.
Yeah, we're not too concerned with SEO, and we touched on this last time a little bit. Google does a really good job at rendering the JavaScript on the front end and then crawling it. I think the more interesting point is definitely performance. Being able to see much faster paints and things like that. For us, we're really interested in possibly integrating Universal with Drupal, and we touched on this a little bit last time, but I think we finally got it all a little bit more hashed out, at least, having a separate Angular Universal Docker container that's just pumping out components, and then we're including all of that with ESI on the main site. So like that would be kind of cool. Yeah, so that would be really performant. You know, we can granularly control our cache times and just let ESIs fill in all the holes of the page. And I'd really love to see something like, so in Drupal we have panels, or we have blocks, or paragraphs, or another layout mechanism. Like being able to see those layouts get output in JSON, and then have something like Angular or whatever process all of that on the front end with ACLs, with everything else that goes with it. That would be something really cool to see. And
that is exactly what my project does. I mean, it's turning a layout into a data model is relatively trivial, and layouts are plugins in core in Drupal 8 now. But the trickier part is making a determination of exactly how much representation a layout has. Because if the point is that an editor should have some idea of what these things are going to look like on a page, how do you determine what a row versus a column is? How do you determine 33% versus 50% width? Things like that. You don't want that kind of data in your data structure probably, but then you're passing actual presentation back and forth between, you know, ends of your CMS or rendering layer, which isn't ideal either. So those are the harder problems that I run into thinking about that stuff.
You say it's trivial, but like just the thought of that scares and like worries me. I would never want to do that. Considering also I come from the WordPress world where we have like page builders where it's like, I look at their markup and I'm like, this is just horrendous. How would this data ever come into fruition of something that's legible? Theoretically, I guess, I'd have to see something done, especially if you could mix it with Universal, just from a speed point of view, like rendering a block, like if it's a block of content, right, that's really never going to change, but changes, whatever, occasionally. That could be super optimized if it was Universal, server-side rendered, and then spit out on the page wherever it is they wanted that to spit out. But then having other blocks on the page that are more time-sensitive information, or get updated more often. But the layout builder concept just freaks me out. I would not.
So we actually built something. One of the speakers for NGATL, Chayla Womack, and I actually built something for that at ADP, and we basically built all of the like bootstrap columns and rows as semantic Angular 2 components back when Angular 2 was alpha, so that was really hard. And then we actually took and made a custom build of Atom that allowed us to drag and drop those components from a tray, including the layout components, and then that converted it to a JSON object that then got sent to our MDF, our meta-driven framework to compile. So I'm not as scared of having the layout in that model. It's just, it can get a little bit gnarly when you start having function calls in your JSON object that are trying to call like autocompletes, because that kind of doesn't parse sometimes. But it was very easy to work with because you could manipulate the JSON directly when you had to, but it also made it really easy to work with a drag and drop editor, which was kind of nice.
So to have that data function, but for function's sake, we're any CMS data next full or live where you guys would do next. Considering we want performance and stuff. Can you guys hear me?
You went full on Tron for a second.
I wasn't sure if that's just on my end. That was
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Sound okay now?
Yes.
Yeah, you're good.
All right. Assuming that we're just spitting out data from the CMS, what's the next like level? Like, is it GraphQL? Like, from a performance point of view, can that layer be standardized? Like, okay, CMS, whatever it spits out, here's the next thing you want that data to go to.
Matt, JSON API.
Well, I mean, I can speak to what the kind of discussions about that are happening in the Drupal world right now, because obviously there's a lot of excitement around GraphQL and the potential that it brings. Right now, the other big contender in the Drupal space is just a specification called JSON API. So what that allows is very similar to what GraphQL allows in terms of the flexibility of your actual resource endpoints and the ability to query a bunch of things at once or include other resources in a single query. But it doesn't have the same full flexibility of determining exactly the structure of the response you're going to receive, because the structure itself is driven by the spec.
With GraphQL, it kind of consumes data beforehand and then spits it out in a standardized kind of format. I don't know. I'm looking at GraphQL right now. I have a pet project I'm working on with Ben's actual framework for the PHP and data side, and then thinking about picking up. There's a plugin for WordPress called WP GraphQL, and performance on it. He's doing some tests, and so far it's been proven to be faster than default REST API, which is amazing because that's awesome. So I'm curious if other people are using GraphQL, and I don't know. Like, my biggest takeaway from ngConf after talking to a couple people about GraphQL was the power was really when you had multiple data sources, and then being able to consume multiple data sources into one standardized kind of data set for your front end. Is it as powerful when you only have one data source on the back end? Is there a point if that data source also has a REST API, in case in point WordPress?
Well, it still gives more control over the API structure to the client, right? As opposed to, you know, I dealt with these massive decoupled CMSs that you had to customize every single endpoint. And then when someone on the client side wanted to spin up a new component that wanted data in a slightly different way or whatever, their choice was either to go to a backend developer and get them to create a whole new endpoint, or piecemeal together from different endpoints the data that they needed. Whereas with GraphQL, you can just do all that on the client side and never have to bother a backend developer. Right?
So Matt, why not loopback?
Loopback's pretty cool. I got a demo of that last year.
So I can attest to why GraphQL would be amazing, because I spent a lot of time doing actual data association, and also in the API URL being able to filter through which of those particular associations that you actually want to be loaded, like side loading pretty much. And that's, you know, like 2 or 3 weeks straight of my dev time that I could have not have to do if I just put GraphQL in front of it and just given that power to whoever's going to be asking for the data, instead of having to figure out schematically how to do it myself and then provide that to whoever.
Yeah, Matt and I were talking to Matt Crutchfield over at CNN, and they're getting ready to go all in on GraphQL for a couple of their Drupal sites that they're spinning up. And it seems really interesting. I think he's got a really good strategy for caching on the edge with Fastly. I think the only thing that worries me is when you have all of these front end devs that can customize, you know, the payload that they're sending and the payload that they're getting back, you know, you're going to have much higher cache miss rates, right? So
unless you have really strong guardrails in place in some other way on them.
Right.
Whether that's just a strong front-end architect that's leading that side or whatever. But you do have to be more careful about that for sure.
And it seems like, gosh, what's the like React and Angular plugins for working with GraphQL? I forget. It seems
Apollo.
like
Apollo,
yeah, it seems like those do a really good job for everyone that is using them of caching on the client, right? And that kind of saves you. But like we're always worried about, well, it's CNN. Somebody's going to want to do a DDoS attack against CNN, right? So you got to look at all those kind of access points that someone could potentially use. And, just looking at GraphQL, that could be a potential DDoS vector. But so could a lot of other things. Maybe I'm just being a little bit too rough on GraphQL. I think for the most part, you can probably get it to cache more than well enough and not spend, an outrageous amount of money on the cloud with it.
Yeah, it does open a potential vector that a traditional REST server may not have. But so does JSON API, by the way. Anything that allows you to link together queries in a relatively abstract way, you have to consider those things.
I think it's interesting that. Go ahead.
I've been also looking at it just from the front end as dynamic content. Like pinging our REST API, you're going to get the same data set and whatever. Manipulating that data, still got to do back-end work on that. But being able to say, hey, on this page, I need, this set of data. On this page with the same endpoint, I need this set of data. It might be different. I feel like that would be really helpful. I do see where the DDoS would be an issue, though, especially when you could theoretically ping for anything, right? And it would just either return or not return it, but you could sit there and try to get something to return anyway.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I kind of lean towards like strong loop or loop back, because that's actually, if I remember right, that's what Salesforce uses for building their data model stuff. So if you ever go into like the back end of Salesforce, and you could basically, any models that you upload, that you create, you can drag and drop your way to a REST API in the Force UI. And from what I've looked at, it seems like that's what they're using. And that basically just persists a configuration for that API, and then it creates an endpoint for it. So it still allows you the ability to create dynamic APIs for any given page, but it's not something that you do from the UI. It's not something that can happen at any time. It's something that has to be persisted, permissioned, and configured and deployed. So it's kind of like possibly a more secure way, I think, of doing things, but at the same time, you lose a little bit of flexibility.
So you're creating the API and you're creating the endpoints as you're building the data models in Loopback? Okay, I need to look at Loopback. That's like Ben's framework for WordPress. It kind of builds endpoints as you build out data models, which I find pretty interesting. I think it's a cool concept from a front-end developer's point of view, trying to build out a back-end. Having a power to build out the data I need, like the models, without necessarily worrying. That's why I like Sales, right? So Sales was like my favorite Node framework, because every time you told it you needed a new model, it would build out a RESTful endpoint for you right away.
I love Sales. That was one of the huge inspirations for me to build out this framework. So I was doing a lot of work in Sales, and then the REST API dropped in WordPress, and I said, well, gosh, now I have to switch. So I'm trying to bring over everything I missed from Sales.
Mm-hmm. And that's what Drupal 8 allows you to do as well. It automatically will build out API endpoints for all of your data models. You don't have to do that yourself. And with the JSON API contributed module installed, it builds those all to the JSON API spec, allowing you to link things together. Like you don't have to, you literally turn that module on and it does it all for you. And then with like Open API module, you can have, Swagger UI, auto document, all those as well. So you can just hand like, here's where you go to your front enders, and here's all your endpoints, and as you modify your data models, it all keeps up.
I feel like we're going backwards because we're talking about data models to API, which feels like that's what a CMS should do, right? I feel like this part of the conversation, maybe we can agree that this part of the conversation, or this part, something a CMS should handle, right? A CMS should handle loopback creating the data models, Drupal's handling data model, WordPress is handling the data model, and they're creating the API. So whatever API it is, it's still being created by the CMS. I feel like GraphQL is just is just consuming the API. So are there any other things that consume API before like you would actually get into the Angular aspect of rendering front end?
My vote, because I love how discoverable the WordPress REST API is a either JavaScript or even just Angular client that just hits that discovery point and builds out the methods. I'm really loving what I've pieced together for that, but I know what I've pieced together is like this compared to what an actual JavaScript developer could actually make. But just that concept of not necessarily having to remember the URL structure, but knowing how the client is going to piece together the object and the methods associated with it.
But I feel like even when I'm looking at the syntax, because Ben did a demo for me yesterday of his front end stuff, I feel like that's still very GraphQL-y. Like just the way that you hit a GraphQL endpoint, at least like on Facebook's GraphQL or something, that's very similar to how you have your setup. You tell it more or less the data that you want and like what you want returned, and then that's what you get.
I guess I'm thinking, we have all of our dream scenarios where we can have any database technology of our choice on top of any CMS of our choice, on top of, I'm assuming, any hosts of our choice. But when it comes down to it, we also have to think bigger picture, and not every host is going to be able to do all of it. So how do you go from ideal to globally applicable and everything in between? Because I would love for everything that I ever do to just be hosted on Google, and Google devs take care of building it all for me, and that would be
Google App Pages coming.
So yeah, there's definitely layers and levels to how much effort you want to put into it. And if you're enterprise, yeah, put all the effort into it. But if you're SMB, or even just like that step before enterprise, or maybe whatever you're working on, it's an internal project and you didn't exactly get all of the budget financing that you needed to build it all out. Like, just trying to think bigger, I suppose.
Well, we're all open source developers, so I feel like we all agree that open source projects should be the way to go. Even with enterprise, you're ideally, coming from a team that has, an enterprise solution that was built, the biggest pain point is just updating maintenance, right? Like, so if you were to use something very custom that was still open source, like an open source CMS, right? At least that aspect of your whole application can be handled by a community of people that you're not paying for, basically. Your enterprise company isn't putting money into it. Well, if you went completely custom from the ground up, you're talking about, okay, anytime there's a bug or a security issue, you need to put resource time into it versus having to, hey, there's an update. It patched all these security issues that we didn't even know existed. Yeah,
you build it, you own it, you break it, you buy it.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I don't know.
I think we'd all rather just stand on the shoulders of giants who.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that's why we love Angular, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm curious.
So in this problem space, I think that's one of the keys, and it sounds like, Ben, you're already kind of working on that for the WordPress world, is how do we lower the barrier to entry for people who want to build these kind of architectures? using whatever tool set. So maybe you're helping lower that barrier to entry with your tool set to people who want to build decoupled WordPress and GraphQL apps or whatever, and Angular apps. I'm doing something very similar in the Drupal world as well, helping to build a distribution, we call it in Drupal vernacular, that gives you a lot of that ability to spin up something that already has all your data models and API endpoints there. And then you can just start writing the front end piece. And now we're actually writing different front end implementations too. I'm helping write the Angular one, and then there's other people who are writing React ones and Vue ones and Elm ones.
Mm-hmm. What if we could agree on the contract between the CMS and Universal, regardless of Comena, Drupal, or WordPress? Because if we could agree on the contract of the data that's returned to Angular in order to be able to render the components and scaffold the page, I think that would help, because that would be agnostic to all three, right?
A contract in terms of the structure of the data, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's tricky though, because the different tools we've been describing as the middle layer have very different structures to them. So if we all agreed that GraphQL was the way, that would be a very different structure than a Falcor or a JSON API or a traditional REST. Right?
So, well, GraphQL is pretty hot in the Angular community. What if we made that assumption?
So like for our builds, CMS should be consumed by GraphQL, and then that should spit out essentially rendered at least to a universal.
And then very similar to what Matt has for reactive Vue and Angular, we could do the same thing for slightly different plugins that would be able to take the GraphQL output by the different CMSs and turn that to what Universal could not only render but also cache.
That would be cool.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. I mean, that'd be something that, that my biggest problem with Angular Universal right now is that there's no PHP solution for it. It's all Node, and I forgot I think it's just Node, or maybe there's one more.
There's .NET as well.
Oh, great.
Wait, .NET got Angular Universal before PHP?
Somebody
I might have to switch to React.
Some enterprise client paid for that, I'm sure.
Well, you do realize that John Papa works for Microsoft, right?
I was about to say I blame John Papa.
Yeah.
And I haven't fully heard the best use case for doing that with PHP, honestly.
For Universal?
I don't see that the need for it to necessarily live on PHP if it's decoupled, right? If you're going through GraphQL, why does it have to be on PHP?
It doesn't, but if you wanted to just stick to the same server or server stack for both your front end and your back end, just for sake of keeping.
It's scary when you're trying to execute. I mean, there is a PHP-ish solution to that where you can execute JavaScript server side in PHP. It ain't pretty, man. I've done it.
Nashorn for Java, is that what you're talking about?
It's the there's a PHP extension to make I forget what it's called off the top of my head.
That sounds kind of scary.
Yeah, I don't recommend it.
I'd be curious to see. I really don't want to play around with it. I'm looking at my little pet project right now. I might spin up a front end instance, which would I'd probably play around with Node and Angular Universal. I honestly think we should agree to that, because I feel like the Angular Universal project needs more love anyway.
I think if we agree on that, it might be more likely, not to fall untold Rob. It may be easier to get Rob's help if we do go that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be cool to see if we could build something that was Angular Universal and then forward, right, like to the render, or maybe just even adding caching into it as a completely agnostic to the CMS. And then we could each build, or each build maybe a connector that we see fit for, WordPress, Drupal, whatever CMS you want, and just maintain that. But like, assume that the connector is going to connect to a universal stack.
What Would there need to be any difference for if Universal is rendering the entire page or rendering a page fragment in Brian's use case?
Probably, yeah.
I think if we were to do any type of build, we'd have to look at, we'd have to agree on what it is we're built. Like, it'd have to be one standardized thing. So I always go with something very simple. Like, you know, with WordPress, it's easy to just, when you're building anything, okay, let's create a blog, right? Create a listing of content and then create the detail, right? It's super easy and you can pretty much go anywhere from there once you have the data out there and rendering. So I'm curious if we could just get to that point and then
that's very similar to the approach we took on the Drupal side too. We all agreed to specific data models for all these different, just as a showcase. So all these different front-end implementations are all building the same recipe website basically. But it's a way to showcase the differences between the frameworks while having that common language. And the hope is you find common sets of problems and common tooling you can pull out of those, right? To, again, help lower that barrier to entry to other people going down this road.
And that's why everyone loves to do MVC when they look at, like, you know, it's essentially the same application over and over and over and over again.
Is there air quotes around the word everyone?
I don't know. I think it's funny that we're having these talks about the latest and greatest technologies of the internet so that we can make a blog.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Well, you start with the blog, so then you can go weather.com or an NBA.com or
yeah, you need to start somewhere. But I'm curious to see, like, based on that data model, right? And you're saying, well, maybe there's a partially rendered page. So maybe we start looking at certain templates and then saying, okay, once we have that, whatever, that detail page there, maybe there's a use case for on that page having a list of something that doesn't render, right? That needs to get rendered separately. How do we do that, right? Then you start adding in use cases and then you start building more and more. And then then you eventually get to your crazy application, you know, or you get to a point where it's like, hey, you can kind of continue from here and we can say, okay, we've built what we wanted to build and this is kind of the standard that we want to say should be this, like, standard for this kind of data model. But yeah, I mean, feel free to come up with another suggestion. It's just a simple, we're talking about CMS and the C in CMS is content. And it's easy just to go that route and just say, hey.
Well, if we want to go a little bit harder, we could do a Shopify clone.
I thought a Hacker News clone was like the other standard.
Oh yeah, well that's for progressive web apps.
Shopify meaning what? Like just an e-com system?
Very light e-com, yeah. But I think that kind of the nice thing about something like a Shopify is that it has a mixture of static. Well, that's more on the CMS side, but the ability to modify content through configuration, but also modify content through the persistence of raw markup, right? So with Shopify, you could build your template and give the users access to modify the content in that template through text boxes. But also you could switch to an advanced mode where you can modify the liquid templates, which are Ruby-based, but use Mustache. And you can modify the liquid templates directly, which those get persisted and rendered. So that's interesting as well.
I'm curious from using Universal, is there like in my mind, I don't know, I made the assumption that it's only front end, right? It's only someone actually, like if we're talking about Shopify, right? You're talking about someone viewing a product or a category, right? A listing of products. Do you use Universal for the actual CMS aspect of it too? Or is there a need?
You can.
I'm sure you can. I'm just saying in the Universal kind of usage, do you do that with the CMS aspect of it?
Well, the problem with that is that you don't get very elegant forms if you take JavaScript out of the picture, right? So even if you're bootstrapping part of it, server side first, you're going to want to put some sugar on it with JavaScript probably to make decent user experiences for forms.
Well, yeah, but we talked about last week how like I didn't know this was a thing, but you can bring in the universal server side, then switch it so it's client side basically.
Yeah,
right?
pre-boot.
Pre-boot, that kind of thing, absolutely. I think that would be a very solid approach.
But like, could you universal the framework, the backbone of the CMS, like, you know, the admin, the menu, whatever, and then whatever page you're on, assuming there's a form, that would get then client rendered.
I'm pretty sure that's what Comena does.
Yeah, there's certainly ways to do that. One of the approaches I've worked on, still letting the backend drive the data modeling itself, is aside from just exposing your API endpoints, also exposing your data models themselves as JSON schemas, which then the front end, there's various libraries that can convert those into basic forms, and then you can write a little custom stuff to make them better than basic forms, and then have those fully decoupled representations of backend data models that still can interact with all your APIs.
So in our sample use case, I'm sorry to bring up the CMS with that question, but we're not actually building out the CMS, so it's irrelevant. Where does it start? Is it just like, hey, let's build out, do we start with sample data and just assume, hey, here's the sample data set that we're all agreeing to, and then let's build out the front end?
Pick a data model. I think that would be the first step.
Okay. I'm cool with that. I think that's
we use API or something. Is there any open source GraphQL repositories that we can use so we're all hitting the same data set?
Good question. I don't know.
that I don't know.
I could ask Uri, but he's probably asleep right now.
Well, I mean, that could be for next week, right? Let's try to do some research and maybe next week roundabout and come back and see if we can come together with a data model or a set that we can all hit. And then from there, we can start building out or thinking about how to build out the, you know, the universal, the caching. I'm curious then how we can then also start building out the CMS aspect, because once we have a data model that we know our front end's going to use, you know, I could work, you know, me and Ben could work together and be like, okay, how do we get WordPress to run this thing? Specifically, if we're talking about Shopify, how do we get WooCommerce, which is running on like large percentages of these stupid e-com sites? How do we get that to power this thing? Because that would be a huge selling point and something I'd be really, really interested in working on.
I mean, if we wanted to just skip the bike shedding of the data model itself, we could just piggyback off the discussions that have already been happening on this in the Drupal world and just use the recipe site data models. They already exist. There's wireframes for them and everything. And we're already building, it's not GraphQL, but we're already building an Angular, implementation of that too. So it would be fun in parallel to be building the Angular GraphQL implementation on the same data models.
Would this also help you out in your personal project? Are you trying to get some
I mean, it would be cool to have a second implementation, yeah.
I think Zach's getting the most out of his this for his personal life. No, but I mean, I think it's a cool use set because, fine, e-com is a little more sexy than blogs, right? But it's all
where the
doable.
money's at.
Yeah, it's where the money, exactly.
Literally.
And it seems like everyone's trying to build the new Shopify. So, yeah, I'm down. So maybe like next week we can everyone kind of go their separate ways. Think about like some data sets. I don't know, Matt, you said you might have one already kind of laying around. Maybe we can figure out if there's any anything else that we can use, or maybe open GraphQL type of things. If not, I'm sure one of us or I can spin up a server if needed. But yeah, let's do
see
that.
if we can get Rob involved next week as well.
Okay, yeah, just ping him and on Twitter or wherever you communicate with him, and just if it's on Twitter, just make sure to add me to the conversation so I can harass him as well.
I'll be down there next Tuesday too. If I see him, I'll throw something at him. I'm meeting with Steven, but hopefully he'll be around.
Where's he based?
In Mountain View.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, down there is ambiguous.
Yeah.
Sorry, I meant at Google.
Okay.
Awesome. Looks like we're at time.
Yeah.
Any other last minute comments or?
I like all the demos we got to today.
Matt, you dropped the ball on this, man.
Yeah, I had nothing.
Time.
It's not ready.
Me and Ben were working on something, but then like 2 minutes before the call started, my local environment decided to take a crap. So I'm going to work with Ben on, but I'm working on his framework right now and adding in the WP GraphQL. So it'll be a cool little project on top of what we're working on.
We should do demo day soon. That would be cool.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be cool just to see what everyone's working on, even if it's not necessarily related to this, but somehow related, you know.
I'm very curious to see more about what you, Roy, and Ben have been working on.
Yeah, cool. All right, so I'll call it for today. Let's try to goal for next week is try to come up with like a data model and how we can power the GraphQL aspect of it.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you guys.
I'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Later.
Bye, guys.